You are in Mandalay Bay, GH, for the session Android Security State of the Union with Adrian Ludwig. A couple quick announcements. There will be a reception tonight in the business hall at 5:30 p.m., which is located in Shoreline A room. The Pony Awards will take place tonight in Mandalay BCD at about 6 p.m. And if you could please make sure to set your phone to vibrate because there are no awesome ringtones. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for coming. This is my first time on this side of the Black Hat stage, so pretty excited to be able to share some of what we're up to. And my screen locked, so you get to see my password. Or at least see that it's got lots of letters in it, and a few numbers, and that I've gotten pretty bad at typing it. All right. That's my live demo of exploiting a system. I just zero-dayed my own Mac. Oh well. So I'm Adrian Ludwig. I am responsible for Android security at Google. I'm here to talk a little bit about how we view the Android ecosystem and the state of security in the Android ecosystem at this moment in time. One of the things that's really interesting about Android is it is in fact an ecosystem. There is not a single point of control, and there are a ton of different viewpoints. And so I want to start off by emphasizing that what I'm going to share is my view. Certainly there are others, and I think it's important that we keep that in mind when we're thinking through sort of what it is that's going on. That said, it's absolutely the case that there are times when it's important to reflect for a moment on what it is that's going on. You know, we've heard a lot in the last week or so about lib stage fright. I'll talk about that in just a minute. We hear a lot about Android security almost on a daily basis. There's a thing in the United States, for those who aren't from the United States, called the State of the Union, where we ask the US president, it's actually written into law, to stand in front of everybody and give a speech about how things are going. It's a sufficiently impossible task that pretty much the only thing any of us remember within the US is the following: the State of the Union is strong. Looking at Android security, and having been a security practitioner for going on 20 years at this point, on almost every side of the coin, from offense to consulting to defense, I'm confident saying that that's true for Android as well. It's certainly the case that we have seen threats and we've responded to those threats. It's also the case that we've taken extensive proactive measures to make sure that the union would stay strong. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what it is that we're doing, and then talk quite a bit about the threats and how we're seeing those threats as well. The union is a complicated one. There are over 1 billion users of Android devices, thousands of OEMs, thousands of devices, an incredible diversity of experience, an incredible diversity of what it really is to be in the Android ecosystem. From a software ecosystem standpoint, it's perhaps unprecedented. Nearly every other platform is a closed platform in a way that Android has strived not to be. Open, diverse, and available everywhere. What that means is that diversity is one of the core attributes, and openness is one of the core attributes of security for the platform as well. There are millions of lines of source code, all available to anybody to review. I've had many interesting conversations about this group or that group and whether they would be allowed to post into open source, and the answer was always the same: absolutely, as long as it's good for the platform and as long as you know your name is going to be on it. That kind of transparency about what goes into the platform allows for extensive security research. It also allows for trust at an unprecedented level for an operating system for mobile devices. You can get it from whoever you want, and you can see what it is that the devices can do. It helps that they're not coming from a single place, that you as an individual can see the opportunity to purchase from a supplier that you like, on a network that you like, which matches the security preferences that you might have. In addition to the contributions being made at the operating system level and in the diversity of devices, one of the things that's unique about Android is that the OEMs themselves, all of us as OEMs, have the ability to make contributions to improve the security of devices, as well as allowing for extensive customization at the software level by application developers, enterprise security solutions, and a variety of other places in the stack. So when I look at Android and I sort of ask, where is the innovation coming from? It's coming from everywhere, which I think in the long run is what makes Android resistant and will make Android resistant to types of attacks that we really haven't seen. And so that's one of the things that I get excited about. This, I think, is like the visual representation of what people think of when they think of security, right? A big safe, heavy iron, completely immutable. And if you look at Android, thinking about safes, those kinds of features have been incorporated, right? Application isolation is at the core of how it is that we've been designing Android from the very beginning. Device integrity is an area that we've made rapid advances, ensuring that both data integrity and application integrity can be ensured. Exploit mitigation is something that we've been investing from the very beginning, recognizing that it's critically important that even if devices aren't able to be patched right this second, they have some line of defense. I'll talk about that a little bit in the context of Live Stage Fright and the vulnerability that we've seen discussed over the last week or two. What's interesting to me, when I put these slides together just a couple of weeks ago, is at first I thought, I'm going to highlight the things that are new, because people care about the things that are new. But over the last week, it was actually the decisions that we made a few years ago. Introducing ASLR, introducing NX, Fortify Source, and some of these exploit mitigations that have proven to be an important line of defense while the rest of the industry works to deliver updates to devices. And so I think it's important that we constantly maintain a focus on the new features, but also recognize that those features are going to be providing lines of defense for years to come. And that's how we're thinking about Android. It's not about building a safe. It's about building something that can react in a dynamic and changing environment. I spend a lot of my time trying to think about analogies, right? So it's not a physical analogy. Maybe it's a biological analogy. Is this security a big toothy animal that if it slows down, dies? No. I think this is how a lot of people think about security in a biologic sense, right? Aggressive predators. But when you look at the Android ecosystem, this is really the more appropriate analogy. Diversity at the core, enabling solutions that are security solutions on a device-by-device basis, a service-by-service basis, that together make for a safe environment. And that's really what we're trying to do, is foster an environment where that kind of innovation can take place at any point in the stack and allow devices to be safe. Layered on top of that, we recognized that there was a need to have uniform rapid response. The focus in rapid response to this point has primarily been in services and making sure that those services are available on all devices. So Google has provided a comprehensive set of security solutions. Google Play, it's just an app store. At least that's how people thought about it a couple years ago. But then we realized that it was a little bit more than that. In fact, it was what gave us the ability to have deep understanding of a developer who's posting an application that might be used by a user. There's a commercial transaction that takes place between Google and that developer. There's also a long history of interactions with those developers that allows us to evaluate the risk associated with specific applications. On top of that, it is a mechanism for us to identify and prevent proliferation of bad applications. I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the consequences that that's had on the Android ecosystem that are favorable from a security standpoint. But what was interesting was it wasn't a visible, high-profile security feature. And it was only years after we'd made Google Play available that we even started talking about that. The protections had been there all along, but the safety preceded the communication. And that's a theme for me over the last couple of weeks, is that the safety in the Android ecosystem often precedes the communication. And so we're going to try to do some communication specifically about some of those issues. But it's not just Google Play that's providing a security service. We've taken that same approach of having a security service available deep into the rest of the device as well, offering safe browsing for Chrome, Verify Apps. Verify Apps essentially is the world's largest antivirus solution. Over 1 billion devices connecting to Google and checking whether the applications that they are installing are safe, based on the analysis that we've conducted in the past, based on, in part, the analysis of the entire ecosystem of application developers as learned by interactions they've had with Google Play, right? We've bound the software development ecosystem to the security ecosystem in a way that's unprecedented. Previously, there was security and there was development, which for me as a consultant kept me in business, right? Because the security people built security tools that nobody wanted to use to scan their code, and then the developers just built things and shipped them. So that's one of the things that's really interesting, is that convergence as a platform between development and security. It's new, and it's happening. I'll talk a little bit about how that makes a difference as well. And then we have a few little things, like SafetyNet, which is an intrusion detection system deployed on over 1 billion devices, as well as an intrusion to reaction. It looks for specific high-risk devices based on characteristics and then reacts to them. It's not perfect. None of these reactive technologies are. But in terms of providing protection at an ecosystem level, it's absolutely vital for making sure that a minimum common denominator is available for all devices. We'll talk about that too. So at a macro level, for a while now I've been talking about these 3 pillars, if you will, of the strength of Android security, right? Robust platform with lots of features that are sort of classic out of Orange Book security features. Comprehensive services that make sure that there's nobody that gets left behind just because they didn't pay their antivirus solution in the last month. And an open ecosystem that allows for innovation that can take place anywhere in the platform. I think there are 4 pillars. And I know I'm not unique in saying this. And I think updates is one that the Android ecosystem needs to be talking more about. And so we're going to do that for a few minutes. Currently, we're updating all Nexus devices to patch issues that have been discussed as lib stagefright. Nexus 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and this is my favorite, Nexus Player. The thing that you use to play videos on your phone, right? Because that's part of the Android ecosystem. We've extended not just to phones, right? This is about a much broader ecosystem than that. Are receiving over-the-air updates, and they've been receiving them, some of them starting this morning, some of them starting a couple of days ago. Our response is not unique. I think in many ways, outside of the Android ecosystem, it's difficult to know how companies are responding. And so we've spent the last couple of days asking them. And here's what they had to say. All of the devices are receiving intense attention at this exact moment. These are devices that are either in the process of receiving OTAs right now, or will be receiving them in the next 3 weeks. This is the industry response. From my perspective, it looks like every device I've ever heard of is getting an OTA at the same time. I guess iPhone's not on there. I've also heard of that. They probably should be getting an OTA for something as well. But it goes way deeper than that. On Sunday evening, I was speaking with Henry Lee, who's a VP of security at Samsung, after stepping out of a restaurant because he called me, because Seoul time and San Francisco time are a little bit different. They had over 150 builds that were coming through Google to be OTA'd in the coming days. On Sunday, right? And that's not unprecedented. But that clarity of what was happening is unprecedented. There were lots of people who were looking and asking what's going on. This is what's going on. My guess, I don't think anybody keeps track of this, my guess is that this is the single largest unified software update the world has ever seen. Hundreds of millions of devices will be updated over the next couple of days. It's incredible. But it's not going to stop there. We wanted to make sure that there's clarity and that the communication issues that lead to strong response, that lead to hype, don't get in the way. And so this morning, we started talking about the fact that we're going to be doing monthly security updates. For those within the Android ecosystem involved in partnerships with Google, they know this isn't a new thing from a practical standpoint. We've been providing security bulletins to partners for over 3 years on a monthly basis. They've been incorporating those patches and they've been making them available. We just haven't been talking about it. And so now we're going to be making them available on a monthly basis, and we're going to be talking about it through security bulletins that'll be coming out immediately after the Nexus OTA comes to the public. It'll enumerate all of the issues that are fixed in the Nexus update. And we promise to do that on an ongoing basis for 3 years, or longer if necessary, from the day that a device first becomes available in market, right? Simple transparency about how it is we're providing these things to the public. It was very exciting for me this morning to also see that Nexus is not alone. Samsung has made a similar commitment. LG has made a similar commitment. As an industry, we've looked at the events over the last few days and weeks, and we've realized we need to move faster, and most importantly, we need to tell people what we are doing, because I think that, in many ways, was the source of much of the confusion. So I hope this clears up what it is that we're doing immediately and on an ongoing basis for all of the major devices that we support directly from Google and that the other partners in the Android ecosystem support as well. There are now 4 major pillars that we'll be talking about on a regular basis when we're describing the state of the union for Android. And I'll be honest, this is Black Hat. We want to talk about bad things. So let's do that. Let's talk about threats. I'm going to talk about malware, exploitation, vulnerability, all of the work that we're doing to try to understand what's going on so that we can have an assessment of the risk that exists in the ecosystem, and to provide all of you the tools that you need, regardless of what your job is, to be effective. So for some of you, that's data. For some of you, that's bug bounties. We want to make sure that all of that is available to you. So first, let's talk about malware. One of the interesting things about malware is that previous ecosystems that have run into problems with malware really had very few checks in those platforms to identify the flow of code through those devices. With Android, and especially for those devices that have Google Play, we've got checks in lots of different places. That makes each one of those checks itself useful, but it also allows us to use one check to measure the effectiveness of the others, which is an interesting sort of theoretical problem, right? How do you know how well you're doing? And so within Google Play, we look at the applications themselves. There are some applications that come from outside of Google Play, and in those cases, the user is at a minimum going to receive a warning that they're installing something from outside of Google Play. They're going to have a confirmation that they're about to install an application. This sort of blows people's minds sometimes. On Android, you just can't get code running without a vulnerability and without user confirmation. Like, that's just different from other platforms that we're more familiar with in the desktop world. The mobile world is sort of fundamentally different in that way, and we're taking advantage of that to make sure that security stays robust. There are additional checks if applications came from outside of Google Play. Verify apps, looking at the content of that application and making a determination of whether it's something that we should warn about. And then there's the core platform capabilities, right? As an operating system sort of oriented person, I think about runtime security checks, I think about sandboxes and permissions, and I think about vulnerabilities there. But I think it's critical that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are all of these layers previous to that that can be an effective mechanism for preventing exploitation of vulnerabilities. And in fact, in the Android ecosystem, vulnerability exploitation, as we'll talk about in just a couple minutes, is extraordinarily low. Almost all of the malware that we see, almost all of the potentially harmful applications, which is our internal way of describing the word malware, so that there's precision around that language, are of the form, the user tried to install it, they chose to install it, and it does exactly what the application said it was going to do through its permissions. And so we're actually providing defenses against social engineering, which are not the types of things that can be implemented in sandboxing and runtime security checks. So I talked about application analysis. What are the sets of things that we look at? We do the traditional analysis of an application, right? Signatures, static code analysis, dynamic behavior. These are the things that I think the antivirus industry in particular has been very effective at generating and producing good defenses for protecting sort of the masses. Much of our emphasis at this point is on the next generation of defenses. These are not signature-based, static code dynamic. These are around trying to root out the behavior associated with the development process and the deployment process, right? Looking for similarity in the application development itself. A simple example. Do they sign it with the same key? Well, if this one was bad, and that was bad, and this one looks fine, but it's signed with the same key, we should block both of them, right? And so we're going to be taking, and have been taking for years now, a more aggressive stance about code that we can tell is related to bad behavior. We, at the very least, can force a conversation, literally a conversation, with the developer to figure out what's going on and understand whether it's good or bad. It's a completely different dynamic from the one that existed when an AV company was in an entirely adversarial role and disjoint from the development process, right? And so similarity and heuristics in many ways are tied more to the development process and less to the behavior of the application itself. There's something else that we're doing, which I'm very excited about, which is combining that with data that's being collected on devices. And this allows for us to instrument functionality in the Android operating system and on devices. It's all in open source. You can see what it is that we're doing. And you have the same capability in other applications as well. But you can gain deep understanding of the behavior of some of the applications on these devices through that transparency. And we feed that into our analysis as well. And of course, we work with third parties. We do our own manual review and look at all that information as well. Ultimately, in the world of Google Play, you either get it's allowed or it's blocked. In the world outside of Google Play, Verify Apps provides a second option, which is we warn the user, hey, this is a rooting app. Do you really want to install it? And they can make a decision about whether they want to or not. I referenced SafetyNet earlier. So this is raw data. For those of you who look at system uptime reports, we actually were changing the logging, and it took a couple days. And so there was a drop in our logging for a couple days. People were still protected. And we didn't fudge the data, but there was a brief period back in June last year where we just don't have logs from that set of time. Google, it happens. Anybody who's run a system at scale knows that that happens. So we built the system and deployed Verify Apps in early 2014 with extensive data. We extended it with SafetyNet in early 2014. This is sort of to give you a sense of the scale of the system, right? This is the number of devices that are checking in with Google that we're performing scans on any given day. The cyclic nature, there's a lot of elements in the Android ecosystem that are cyclic. People use devices differently during the week, et cetera. This cyclic nature is actually something that we put into the system because the devices basically check in once a week. And it took a while for that to normalize after the rollout took place. And then we did some forced normalization to get it a little bit more smooth. So the early cyclic is our fault. The later is actually ecosystem effects. The decline around the end of last year, early this year, was a conscious decision on our part to modify the way we were interacting with the service to reduce the load on user devices. We, at that point, had been looking at the data for long enough, and we realized checking in every 6 days, not necessary. Let's move to 7 for some devices, and let's move to different numbers for others. You'll see an increase in the last month of data that I have here that's available. That's actually an increase because we decided to turn things up in Russia specifically, based on data that we were seeing there and the need to provide more aggressive response in that particular region of the world. And interestingly enough, we haven't talked about it a lot publicly, but we've started to see other security companies describe in Russia a decrease in what they consider to be malware, what we consider to be potentially harmful applications. They don't know why. But we're reasonably confident it's because at scale, we were able to deploy protection to nearly all devices in Russia, in the same way that we're doing that for the rest of the world. We put out a ton of data about 2 or 3 months ago. We're going to be putting out more and more of this data. My goal as an individual is to get to a point where we can have that kind of dashboard, country by country, language by language, et cetera, available. It's not going to be in near real time. It'll probably be on a 60 to 90 day delay, but this information should all be available, right? These are things that are critical for you as an enterprise, if that's the business that you're in, to be able to understand the risk that you have for your devices. And so we want to make that available. Right now it's in document format, but we like dashboards better. And so we're going to get to a point where we can make that available. One of the things that's defined in that document is the definition of a PHA, potentially harmful application. I'm going to talk about those for a couple more minutes. So this is the percentage of devices worldwide that do not have a PHA installed. This is for all devices. And you can see over the period of time that's here, about 6 months. Again, I mentioned that we do a tape delay of about 90 days in order to make sure that the data is clean, right? Because sometimes we miss things and we have to go back. And so this is tape delayed by about 90 days. This gives you a sense for the overall, what we consider to be device hygiene for the ecosystem. So in general, over the last 6 months, and we've seen this going back further than that as well, around 0.5% of Android devices have some potentially harmful application installed on them. We work very quickly to clean them, which is what makes the graph go up. And then there's new things that get discovered, and that makes the graph go down. This is a complex interaction, and we have no expectation in an ecosystem the size of Android that the number's ever going to be 0. There will always be some new person who's decided they want to write some bad application, and they've published it somewhere in the world. There will be users who will install it. We will be looking for it at incredible scale, and when we find it, we will take it down. But there will be some amount of churn. And so our goal is to get that churn as low as possible while doing as little damage to the user experience on these devices as possible. So that's what we're tracking, right? These are our internal metrics for making sure that we're doing that. This is the same data flipped upside down and broken down by language, just to keep things as simple as possible. It gives you a sense for why targeting specific regions of the world and tuning our response to those specific regions of the world makes sense. Russia, in particular, has been persistently the high water mark for potentially harmful applications. If you look towards the end here, sort of mid-March, that number starts to drop. And the reason it drops is because we increased the frequency that we were responding, and we started to take more aggressive measures, particularly targeted at Russia. We're planning on, hopefully, being able to talk more about that publicly in the future, but this gives you a hint at what it is that we're doing. There are a couple of other areas of the world where we've seen periodically increases in activity. Persian language in particular is one where we've seen increases in activity on a fairly regular basis. It's not as substantial as what we see in Russia, but it is something that we see. Chinese devices have also had some instances of increased exposure. China is particularly interesting, and if you go look at the report that I referenced earlier, because the behavior there is actually just in many ways distinct from the rest of the world. There are large corporations that sponsor teams to find rooting vulnerabilities in order to incorporate rooting vulnerabilities into the functionality of their applications. Right? It's the equivalent, in many cases, of Google rooting your device. We're working to make sure that those companies understand the consequence of that. One of the consequences, of course, those applications can't be in Google Play. Another is Verify Apps warns the user about that. And so over time, I think we're seeing normalization of behavior on a worldwide basis, but that's going to take some time. This is a global view, again, just to give you a sense for the difference between devices that have the ability to install applications from unknown sources and devices that are only installing basically from Google Play. The risk profile for them is substantially different. The risk profile for a device that's installing only from unknown sources, or installing from only Google Play, meaning they have unknown sources disabled, is well under about 0.15%. It's been stable at that level. For devices that are installing from outside of Google Play, borders around 1%, right? Which is where you get the blended average of about 0.5% across all of the devices in the ecosystem. So these are the things that we're using to analyze and understand the state of the union. I sort of talked about this a little bit already, but I do want to emphasize that 0 is really not the goal. It's both unrealistic and not the most effective way to manage an ecosystem. There is functionality that is desirable, but that is risky. Right? We know that. People want to be able to do lots of things. That when they do it, it's good. But if some other application did it in an unexpected manner and there wasn't adequate disclosure, it's bad. And so that's some of the tension that exists, and one of the reasons that we're never going to have this go down to 0. A perfect example of that. Is rooting good or bad? This should be, I want to take a poll, but I don't want to take a poll at the same time. Yes is the answer in both ways. It's both good and it's both bad. Freedom of the individual is very important. I don't know. I don't know where to come down on this one. But I think it's a perfect example of the tension that exists, right? And why it is that there's going to be lots of investment in exploit development, lots of investment in research, and one of the reasons why we make Nexus devices unlockable is to make sure that for those users who want to have that kind of flexibility, they have it. And there's an outlet. And we are an open ecosystem. There are many other members of the Android ecosystem that do the same thing, delivering devices that are unlockable. We think that flexibility is critical. And we think it's really fascinating to watch what happens when it's not available. What does happen? Exploits happen. Let's talk a little bit about exploits. So I mentioned safety net. The phrase that I used was an intrusion detection and prevention system. I'm old school from a marketing standpoint, meaning I don't even know what the current description of an intrusion detection. I'm sure I'm like dating myself by 15 years. Basically, we look for data on the device, anything that we think could be potentially relevant and that's available, because remember, the Android security model makes a lot of data not available for security and privacy reasons. We analyze that, and we try to find what's going on. So what are some examples of that? Well, one of the examples is looking for abusive SMS. The classic abusive SMS, if you were to go back a few years, was to have an application that tried to send a premium SMS. So a feature that was introduced a few years ago in Android was a warning to the user about whether a particular SMS was premium or not. If a user says yes, they want to send that SMS from that application, that's probably an indication, maybe not a perfect one, but a reasonably good signal that that's intentional behavior on behalf of that application, and there's not cognitive dissonance between the application and the user. On the other hand, if lots of people are saying no, A, that's great, they've been protected by the platform, but B, we can do more than that in that we can understand that that's an application that should not exist at all. It should get blocked higher in the stack. And so that's a really simple example of how we're looking at data on these devices and then being able to move higher in the stack to provide protections through things like safe browsing, or provide them through Verify apps, or do better scanning of applications in Google Play based on that type of data collection. But it doesn't just stop with going up the chain. We've also been very active in putting capabilities to make changes on the device in real time. Again, referencing SMS, the list of numbers that are commercial varies by region, by country, by time. Sometimes carriers will make a decision that the service that used to be premium is no longer premium. And so there is the ability in the platform to update those lists. Right? It sounds really simple, but thinking about how you introduce checks that a couple of years later will turn out to be useful is one of the amazing exercises that we go through when we're looking at the Android platform. One of the examples that we haven't talked very much about is called the inter-app firewall. Right? It's really called the intent firewall if you want to go search for it. It looks at intents. You can blacklist them. Why did that get introduced? Because many years ago, there was a specific application on a specific device that if it received an intent from the browser, which was a perfectly reasonable set of expectations, it could cause harm to the device. And we didn't have a solution. They had to update the device. But we thought about it and we said, you know what, we can do better than that. We can make sure that in the future, there is a mechanism that firewalls from one application to another in order to protect the user. And so we introduced the inter-app firewall, and we didn't use it. We didn't talk about it. It existed in the API documents. It wasn't a secret. And then we were looking in Russia specifically, and we realized that it was a key way for us to be able to disable some of the potentially harmful applications that had become persistent there. We used it, enabled it. That's one of the reasons that you see that dramatic decline just a couple of months ago. So that's one of the things that we do with SafetyNet, is try to deploy those types of protections. The other thing that we try to do is maintain perspective on what's actually going on. Black Hat's been fun for not just this year, for me on the Android security team, but for the last 3 years. These are the two previous Black Hats and vulnerabilities that were both found by Blue Box. Great work on behalf of those guys. They worked with us in a coordinated manner, and in exactly the same way that Joshua did, just to make sure I'm not impugning anybody, to make sure that those patches were available, that we were able to respond, et cetera. One of the things that was really interesting about Master Key and Fake ID is that they were perfectly instrumentable, meaning not only did we have checks in Verify Apps and Google Play that gave us perfect visibility, but because they were in the signing mechanism and because we had logs going back for years, we know for the billion devices that check in with us how frequently there was exploitation. And so we have the ability to analyze that relative to the headlines, which I think is pretty interesting. And it's one of the things that we're constantly trying to do, is understand, can we put the exploitability of a specific issue into context and make sure that the conversation about that issue, whether it's historical in this instance or forward-looking, is sort of grounded in reality. And so hype, in many cases, drives the very early conversation, and then more information is introduced that helps to stabilize that conversation. So let's talk a little bit about libstagefright, because I promised that I would talk specifically about that. And I don't think there's anything that's on this slide that hasn't already been talked about by the folks at Zimperium, that hasn't been talked about on blog posts, that hasn't been talked everywhere. But I want to make sure that we kind of have shared understanding of what the facts are. It is the case that nearly all Android devices, as of 6 months ago, had a vulnerability. It allowed for taking control of program counter, instruction control. I actually wrote exploits back in the day. I don't sound as ignorant, or I'm not as ignorant as I sound at this exact moment. But what was interesting was that a lot of devices had thought about that and had defenses in place. They're not perfect defenses, they're statistical. We refer to them as mitigations very reasonably, because what they do, in my view, is buy time. Right? That's the point of these mitigations. If you haven't found it yet, they make life more difficult for the attacker. And if you have found it, they give you time to recover. Right? And one of the interesting things about the Android ecosystem is the diversity of devices is itself a natural mitigation. Every single exploit at this point that's a remote exploit has to have some level of customization on a device level, on a patch level, et cetera. You know, crop blights happen because everything's the same. We don't know what happens in a software ecosystem when everything is different. We haven't had this before. But it seems to be a powerful and underutilized tool. What we do know, though, was that ASLR was implemented in Ice Cream Sandwich, Android 4.0, and we do know that over 95% of devices at this point have ASLR. So we know that a fire and forget attempt at an exploit delivered over something like MMS is really difficult on those devices. Difficult in the I ain't seen it done yet kind of way. And I would love to see it done, because that is a mitigation that we can then get into Android now. So that 4 years from now, when there's a new exploit that we don't know about, people already have more time. Right? So that's one of the things that I want to emphasize. Yes, there was some protection. Yes, it bought us some time. And yes, people didn't talk about it to start with, which I think is a communication issue that we're working on. And I applaud the folks at, Joshua in particular, but the folks at Zimperium on helping to get the word out that there was a little bit of confusion early on, and we're trying to do the same. There are other things that you can do. You can change the applications. Google Messenger applications being updated by the end of this week so that it will no longer play video delivered over MMS automatically. It didn't actually play it automatically. What it did was extract the assets in order to give you a thumbnail. I'm sorry, for some period of time in the near future, your Hangouts and Messenger behavior is going to be a boring thumbnail as opposed to a topically relevant thumbnail generated from that piece of content. But that's a defense in depth measure to make sure that the risk to users has been reduced. I've mentioned already that Nexus devices are being updated over the air right now. And we're in the midst of what I think may be the largest software update cycle the world has seen until next month. And we'll do it all again. So with that backdrop, SafetyNet is giving us visibility into some of these exploits. One of the things that we're also interested in is instrumenting behaviors to see whether there are exploits that we don't know about. This is not a useful slide. This is a slide that shows you that we're trying to understand whether there are issues related to SSL v3 downgrades, and unfortunately so far we haven't found them. There's some like weird anomalies, like European nations have downgrade to SSL v3 more frequently than Asian nations. We don't know why. We suspect it's related to the structure of operator networks, telcos and carriers, and age of those networks, et cetera. We don't know. But it's the kind of thing that we're looking for. There's some needle in the haystack kind of investigation, which is graphically interesting, but not at this point informative. But it's one of the types of things that we're looking for. Other slides and other data that we're collecting are immediately actionable and immediately interesting. This is, I think, the only slide that I have that on the left-hand side has an absolute number. I mentioned earlier we scan about 150 to 200 million devices a day. Out of those, we're seeing 200 to 600 that have a compromised Google.com certificate or are responding in a manner that indicates that they have a compromised Google.com certificate on their device. We've analyzed those. What we consistently see on those devices is that they have installed, after having had the device rooted, a certificate that, from a marketing standpoint, has like the name of a company that does man-in-the-middle for an enterprise or for schools or for somebody else. So we can tell what's going on there. At least it has all of the hallmarks of somebody intentionally installing a solution that's designed for this purpose. Whether the user knows that that's what's going on in the device, I don't know. But certainly the case that somebody who's had physical control of the device knows what's going on. They probably paid for this service. We are, by the way, before I advance from that, making changes in disclosure to make sure that the user of the device does know what's going on there. So that where we see potential tampering or rooting of the device, there's more visibility into those kinds of things. And where there's certificates that have been added, the user has visibility into them as well. Another thing that we're looking at is SE Linux. SE Linux at this point is the canonical representation of the Android security model. I want to say that again. SE Linux is the Android security model. It's really that straightforward. And Nick Kralevich, I'm sure, I think he is not here, actually. And Stephen Smalley and a bunch of other folks would be excited that that's the point we're at. It's the mechanism for defining the interactions at an application level. It's a mechanism for understanding the attack surface. There's a comprehensive set of never allow rules that can strain that attack surface and provide defense in depth in the event of a local compromise to minimize the likelihood of privilege escalation, and on and on. It defines Android security model on a device. So it's pretty important if you want to understand what's going on out there in the world. So this is a simple ask from a device. Do you have SE Linux turned on? If your answer is no, something's not right. Or if your answer is yes, but I'm permissive, something's not right as well. So that's something that we're tracking. And at this point, we're seeing about a quarter of devices in the world at this point. You're signaling this. Does that mean 5 minutes left, or does that mean I'm done? Okay, so there was some rapid acceleration in time at that point, because this clock still says 6 minutes. We may want to check on something. So vulns. I will be cognizant of my next speaker, and I will say we're a platform. We have security boundaries. Those security boundaries are important. That's the definition of the security model. We've talked about that a little bit already. A thing that for this community is absolutely important is the announcement of Android Security Awards a few months ago. One of the really interesting things that we've done with the Android Security Awards is think very hard about how to structure these rewards in a manner that works to the strengths of the Android ecosystem around diversity of devices and multiple sources of innovation. So how does that work? We pay for bugs and tests and CTS tests. And those value amounts are comparable to, say, the Chrome bug bounty in terms of what it is that we pay out. But in addition to that, baked into the program, we have a strong emphasis on exploit chains. So out of the gate, we pay a lot more for people who provide exploit chains. And we tier how much we pay based on how useful your contribution is to the entire ecosystem. So a bug is very useful. A bug and a test for that bug that can be deployed to all of the industry so they can understand whether devices are vulnerable is that much more useful in clarifying the state of particular devices. Tests that have been incorporated into CTS and are available on devices, that much more valuable, etc. I said the numbers look similar. They do. And then they go up from there. Right? For individuals who are able to generate exploits and demonstrate that the mitigations that are in place are insufficient for the state of the art, because that's what our expectation is, that these bugs that are coming in are going to be the state of the art, then we want to pay a lot for them. I can't make promises. Given the response we've seen so far, I think these numbers are going to have to go up in order to get a compelling response from the research community. We'll see how that shakes out, because it's a new program. You add it all up, $38,000 per issue to anybody that finds and reports an exploit of that form. There's more details. The other thing that we've done is to focus a lot on application-level vulnerabilities. We've added new features to help users protect themselves. One of these that I want to draw special attention to, actually two of them, are not platform-level features. They're capabilities provided in Google Play. One of them is the ability to use a version of OpenSSL in a security provider provided by Google Play. This is important if you're running on a device that has not been updated, but you want the most recent version of OpenSSL. You can get it. It's available. You can use it. Go. Use it. The last thing that I want to talk about is developer security warnings. We have the ability to interact with developers. This is new in the security space. This is new. Let's use it. We scan all of the applications that come into Google Play. We look for potentially harmful behavior. We look for malware. We also look for people making mistakes. Introduction of vulnerabilities that are unintentional. Over the last year, we've begun to roll out developer security warnings, raising for all application developers the minimum bar for development of applications in response to security issues. We've warned lots of apps, because you know what? Developers make mistakes. And they respond by fixing those apps. And there, zero is the goal. I'm now being shepherded off even more aggressively. I thank you all for your time. I'll be around, as always. And if you have any questions, you can send them to me, aludwig@google.com, or you can inundate folks on my team at security@android.com. They always love to hear from fans. Thank you very much.